My son and his wife ignored me for 8 years straight, then walked into my company boardroom like they owned the place, expecting to inherit everything I'd built. I looked at Marcus, my own flesh and blood, standing there in his expensive suit with that entitled smirk, and said 5 words that changed our family forever. "You're visitors, not heirs." The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Victoria's face went white as printer paper, and Marcus looked like I'd just slapped him across the face in front of his precious wife. But you know what? After 8 years of being treated like I didn't exist, after missing my own mother's funeral, after ignoring me when I was lying in that hospital bed, wondering if I'd die alone, they had it coming. If you've ever been abandoned by family who only remembered you existed when they needed something, if you've ever built something with your own hands only to have ungrateful people assume they deserved it, settle in, because this story's going to hit different. Today, this coffee tastes like vindication, and this tale is about what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. I spent 30 years building Mitchell Construction from nothing, started with a beat-up pickup truck and a toolbox my father left me when he passed. Worked 16-hour days, missed dinners, sacrificed everything because I thought I was building a legacy for my son. Thought family meant something. Thought blood was thicker than the water they've been throwing in my face for nearly a decade. But here's what I learned that day in my boardroom, sitting behind the mahogany desk I earned with calloused hands and sleepless nights. Respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And loyalty? That's a two-way street these two had been ignoring for far too long. Marcus stood there sputtering about family obligations and birthright, while Victoria clutched her designer purse like it was a life preserver on a sinking ship. They'd come expecting a warm reunion and a keys to the kingdom ceremony. Instead, they got a lesson in consequences that was 8 years overdue. And if you believe that actions have consequences, that loyalty should be rewarded, and abandonment shouldn't be, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm Robert Mitchell, and I've got stories about building something from nothing, about family betrayal, and about the moment you finally stop being a doormat and start being a man. Because what happened after I said those 5 words? Well, let's just say they learned that bridges once burned don't rebuild themselves just because you suddenly need to cross them again. Let me take you back to when Marcus was 7 years old, standing on a milk crate in my garage workshop, wearing safety goggles that were way too big for his little head, holding a hammer like it was Excalibur itself. "Dad, when I grow up, can we build houses together?" he'd ask, and I'd ruffle his hair and tell him that someday Mitchell and Son Construction would have both our names on the sign out front. After his mother Linda died in that car accident when Marcus was 15, drunk driver ran a red light and took the love of my life in an instant. It became just us against the world. 2 Mitchell men who had to figure out how to keep going when our foundation had been ripped away. I worked doubles to pay for his private school, sold Linda's jewelry to cover his college tuition, took out loans against the business to make sure he had every opportunity I never did. Marcus was brilliant, always had been. Graduated summa cum laude from business school, landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm in Manhattan, started making more money in his first year than I'd made in my best 5. I was so proud I kept copies of his business cards in my wallet, showed them to anyone who'd listen. "That's my boy," I'd say, "going to change the world." But somewhere between the corner office and the expensive suits, between the Manhattan apartment and the country club memberships, my son started changing. Phone calls got shorter. Visits became, "I'm really swamped with work, Dad. Maybe next month." The boy who used to call me his hero started talking to me like I was some embarrassing relic from his past he needed to manage. Then he met Victoria Ashworth at some charity gala, old money, private school, the kind of woman who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow felt qualified to judge everyone who had. She was beautiful, I'll give her that, but there was something cold behind those perfectly made-up eyes. Something that looked at people like me and saw problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. The first time Marcus brought her to dinner at my house, the same house where he'd grown up, where Linda and I had raised him with love and sacrifice, Victoria spent the entire evening pointing out everything that needed updating. The kitchen was so dated, the furniture was quaint but impractical, and my stories about building the business were charming in that tone that meant exactly the opposite. After that dinner, Marcus pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "Dad, Victoria comes from a different world. Maybe we should, I don't know, meet at restaurants from now on." Neutral territory. Neutral territory. Like the home where I'd raised him was some kind of war zone, instead of the place where every dream he'd ever achieved had been nurtured and supported. The wedding was the first real sign of how far I'd fallen in my son's priorities. Not the planning. Victoria had taken over that completely, hiring some exclusive wedding planner who treated me like hired help whenever I dared to ask about details. Not the guest list. Apparently my construction crew buddies and the neighbors who'd watched Marcus grow up weren't suitable for the country club venue they'd selected. No. The real wake-up call came when Marcus handed me the invitation to my own son's wedding. I wasn't listed as the father of the groom. I was listed as Mr. Robert Mitchell in the same font size as every other guest. When I asked Marcus about it, he got that uncomfortable look he'd been wearing more and more around me. "Victoria's family is handling the formal aspects, Dad. It's just how they do things in their circle." Their circle. Like I wasn't part of any circle that mattered anymore. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give them that. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, flowers that probably cost more than most people's cars, a reception at the Riverside Country Club where the cheapest bottle of wine cost what I used to spend on groceries for a month. I sat in the third row, not the front row where fathers of grooms traditionally sit, but the third row, behind Victoria's great-aunts and some business associates of her father's. During the reception, I barely saw Marcus, except from across the room. Every time I tried to approach him for a conversation, Victoria would materialize like smoke and steer him away to meet someone important or handle some urgent detail. I spent most of the evening at a table with Linda's sister Carol and a few distant relatives, watching my son celebrate the biggest day of his life. Like I was just another guest he was obligated to accommodate. The thank you note they sent afterward was addressed to Mr. Mitchell and signed Marcus and Victoria, not Dad or Love your son, just Mr. Mitchell, like I was someone they'd barely met who'd happened to send a wedding gift. The gift, by the way, was a check for $20,000, money I'd saved for years, hoping to contribute something meaningful to Marcus's new life. The note, thanking me, was identical to the ones they'd sent to every other guest, printed and impersonal. But the real heartbreak came 6 months later when I called to invite them to Thanksgiving dinner. Victoria answered Marcus's phone, apparently he was in a meeting, and informed me that they'd already made plans with her family for the holidays. "We're trying to establish our own traditions now, Robert," she said, using my first name like we were acquaintances instead of family. "I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand. I understood that the little boy who used to help me hang Christmas lights was now too busy with his wife's traditions to spare a few hours for the man who'd raised him. I understood that somewhere along the way I'd become inconvenient, embarrassing, disposable. What I didn't understand was how I'd let it happen, how I'd stood by and watched my son slip away without fighting harder to keep him. The abandonment became total and systematic after their first year of marriage. It started with missed birthdays. Mine passed without even a phone call, while I still religiously sent cards and gifts for theirs that went unacknowledged. Then Christmas became too complicated for them to visit. Thanksgiving was always spent with Victoria's family, and Easter somehow never worked with their increasingly busy social calendar. When my mother, Marcus's grandmother, the woman who'd helped raise him after Linda died, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I called Marcus immediately. She had maybe 6 weeks left, and she kept asking when he was coming to see her. "I'll try to get away, Dad," he said, but I could hear Victoria in the background talking about some charity event they couldn't miss. He never came. Not once during those final 6 weeks did my son visit the woman who'd sung him lullabies and helped him with homework and loved him unconditionally. The funeral was on a Tuesday in October, leaves falling like tears outside the funeral home where Linda and I had planned our own services years before. I kept looking at the door, hoping Marcus would walk through it, hoping he'd realize that some things are more important than whatever Victoria had scheduled for that day. The service started, progressed, ended. He never showed. His own grandmother's funeral, and he couldn't be bothered to take one day off work to say goodbye to the woman who'd helped raise him. That was when I knew I'd lost him completely. Not to distance or busy schedules or different priorities, but to a woman who'd convinced him that his family wasn't worth his time, that the people who'd loved him before he was successful didn't deserve his attention now that he was. The heart attack came 18 months later, massive coronary, while I was working late in my office, reviewing blueprints for a new hospital project. Eleanor, my secretary, found me collapsed next to my desk and called 911. I spent 2 weeks in intensive care, machines beeping around me like some kind of technological death march, wondering if I was going to die alone in that sterile room. I gave Elena Marcus's number from my hospital bed. "Please call my son," I whispered through the oxygen mask. "Tell him his father almost died." She called. Victoria answered. "We're in Europe for Marcus's business conference," she said. "We'll try to call when we get back." Try to call, like their fathers don't die every day, like there might not be time for trying once they got back from their vacation. I lay in that hospital bed for 14 days, watching other patients receive flowers and visitors and love, while my bedside table stayed empty except for the get well card Elena brought from the office staff. 14 days to think about how I'd built an empire with the dream of passing it on to my son, only to realize that my son had already inherited something more valuable from his wife's family, the ability to forget where he came from. When I was finally discharged, I drove home to an empty house that felt like a mausoleum. No calls, no visits, no acknowledgement that I'd almost left this world without seeing my son one last time. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. The silence stretched on for years after my recovery, becoming a living thing that grew larger and more suffocating with each passing season. I stopped calling Marcus. What was the point when every conversation felt like an obligation he couldn't wait to end? I stopped sending birthday gifts that were never acknowledged, stopped extending invitations that were always declined, stopped hoping that somehow we'd find our way back to being father and son instead of strangers who happened to share DNA. Elena became my closest confidant during those lonely years, the only person who witnessed how hard I worked to build something meaningful while my personal life crumbled around me. She'd see me staring at old photos of Marcus during lunch breaks, looking at that little boy in the safety goggles who'd promised we'd build houses together someday. "He'll come around, Mr. Mitchell," she'd say. But we both knew she was just being kind. I threw myself into work with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy for a man in his late 50s who'd already had one heart attack. Mitchell Construction expanded aggressively. We won the contract for the new county courthouse, then the regional hospital, then a series of government housing projects that required security clearances and congressional approval. What had started as a small family business became a multi-million-dollar operation with 3 offices and over 200 employees. The success felt hollow without anyone to share it with. I'd built an empire, but I was ruling over it alone, surrounded by employees who respected me and friends who cared about me, but missing the one person I'd always imagined would be standing beside me when we reached the top. Every groundbreaking ceremony, every ribbon cutting, every award dinner, I attended them all as a successful businessman who happened to be utterly alone in the world. Tom Bradley, my business partner and the closest thing I had to family anymore, tried to convince me to reach out to Marcus, "Pride's a luxury you can't afford at our age, Robert," he'd say over our weekly poker games. "Life's too short to let this go on forever." But it wasn't pride keeping us apart. It was the simple fact that my son had made his choice years ago, and that choice didn't include me. I started spending holidays at the office or traveling alone, visiting construction sites in other states, keeping busy so I wouldn't have to think about the empty chair at my dinner table. Christmas became just another day, birthdays became deadlines to meet, and family traditions became memories I tried not to access too often because they hurt too much. The house where Marcus had grown up, where Linda and I had planned to grow old together, became a museum of a life that used to matter. I kept his room exactly the way he'd left it for college. Baseball trophies on the shelves, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, photos of us building tree houses and fishing on summer weekends. Sometimes I'd stand in that doorway and wonder what I'd done wrong, where I'd failed as a father to raise a son who could abandon his family so completely. But mostly, I just worked. 16-hour days became my normal, 7-day weeks became routine, and building things with my hands became the only therapy that made sense anymore. If my son didn't want the legacy I was creating, fine. I'd find someone else who understood what loyalty meant, what family was supposed to be about. The morning they walked into my office unannounced was a Tuesday in March, 8 years and 4 months since Marcus had last spoken to me. Elena buzzed my intercom with confusion in her voice. "Mr. Mitchell, your son and his wife are here. They don't have an appointment, but they're insisting on seeing you immediately." I told her to send them in, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. They strode into my boardroom like conquering generals surveying their new territory. Marcus, in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, Victoria dripping diamonds and attitude in equal measure. They didn't knock, didn't ask permission, didn't show even the basic courtesy you'd extend to a stranger's office. They walked in like they owned the place, which I quickly realized was exactly what they'd come to discuss. "Hello, Dad," Marcus said, and the word dad came out rusty, like he'd forgotten how to pronounce it properly after 8 years of avoiding it. "We need to talk about the business. Not how are you, or I'm sorry we haven't spoken, or I heard you almost died and I should have been there. Just straight to the business, like that was the only thing about me that had ever mattered to him. Victoria settled herself into the chair across from my desk, like she was auditioning to be the new CEO, her eyes scanning the awards on my walls, the contract spread across my desk, the view of the city skyline that represented everything I'd built while they were busy forgetting I existed. "Robert," she said, using my first name with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes, "Marcus and I have been discussing the future of the family business." Family business. 8 years of silence, and suddenly it was a family business again. 8 years of treating me like a stranger, and now they were ready to talk about futures and legacies and responsibilities they'd never shown any interest in carrying. "We've been consulting with financial advisors," Marcus continued, pulling out a folder thick with documents I hadn't been asked to review. "And we think it's time to modernize operations, maybe bring in some younger perspectives, update the management structure." Younger perspectives, management structure. He was talking about my life's work, like it was some failing corporation that needed saving, instead of the thriving empire I'd built brick by brick while he was playing house with his trust fund wife. The audacity was breathtaking. They'd walked into my office after 8 years of complete abandonment, expecting to be welcomed back as prodigal heirs ready to claim their inheritance. No apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the years they'd left me alone to build this empire while they were busy being too important to return phone calls or attend funerals or visit dying fathers in hospital rooms. I sat back in my chair, the chair I'd earned through 30 years of 16-hour days and blood and sweat and sacrifice they'd never bothered to witness, and looked at these two strangers who happened to share my last name. That's when I said the words that had been building in my chest for 8 long, lonely years. "You're visitors, not heirs," I said, my voice steady as the foundation of every building I'd ever constructed. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that boardroom, could have heard their hearts stop beating as the reality of those 5 words sank in. Marcus's face went through about 6 different emotions in 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, anger, panic, and finally, something that might have been recognition of just how badly he'd miscalculated this reunion. Victoria's mouth fell open like a fish gasping for water, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the arms of her chair like she needed physical support to process what she'd just heard. "Dad, you can't be serious," Marcus finally managed, his voice cracking like he was 13 again instead of 34. "I'm your son. This is my birthright. You built this for me." But that was where he was wrong. I'd built this for the son who used to stand on milk crates in my garage, not for the stranger who'd abandoned me for 8 years and only returned when he realized I was worth something. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the new will I'd had my lawyer draft 6 months earlier, after spending another Christmas alone, another birthday forgotten, another year wondering if my son even remembered my name. "Your birthright was having a father who loved you unconditionally," I said. "My legacy goes to people who've actually been part of my life. Elena Rodriguez, the woman who'd worked beside me for 15 years, who'd held my hand in that hospital room when no one else came, who'd celebrated every victory and weathered every setback of building this empire. She was getting 40%. Tom Bradley, my partner and friend who'd stood by me when family wouldn't, got 30%. The remaining 30% was going to a scholarship fund for kids from working families who wanted to study construction and engineering." Marcus stood up so fast, his chair rolled backward into the wall. "You're making a mistake, old man," he said, and there it was. The real person underneath all that expensive education and borrowed sophistication. "We'll contest this. We'll fight you in court. You can't just cut out your own son." "Watch me," I replied, standing up behind my desk, every inch the man who'd built something lasting while they'd been playing dress-up in their Manhattan penthouse. "You cut me out of your life 8 years ago. Now I'm returning the favor." They stormed out of my office that day, Victoria's heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots, Marcus shouting threats and promises that sounded more desperate than dangerous. Elena watched them leave and simply said, "Good for you, boss. It was about time." The legal challenges came, just like Marcus promised. Expensive lawyers, private investigators, court filings that tried to paint me as mentally incompetent or unduly influenced. But here's the thing about building a business from nothing. You learn to keep good records, surround yourself with loyal people, and never make important decisions when you're emotional. Every signature on that will was witnessed, every change documented, every decision legally bulletproof. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between blood family and the family you've chosen? Have you ever reached the point where you realize that respect isn't something you inherit? It's something you earn through your actions, day after day, year after year? If this story made you think about the people in your life who've actually shown up when it mattered, who've been loyal when loyalty wasn't convenient, who've earned their place in your heart through their actions instead of their DNA, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I'm Robert Mitchell, and I've got more stories about building something lasting, about the difference between being related to someone and being family with them, and about what happens when you finally stop being a doormat and start being a man who knows his own worth.